talk about buying your rebar. Now you can run out to Lowe's and buy individual sticks, but they are going to charge you a crazy amount. Now what I did is I called up my local steel yard and just bought it in bulk. So my steel yard sells it by the ton for less than half the price as if you went to Lowe's. Now when you call them up, you're going to have to pretend like you know what you're talking about. So this is number 4 rebar, which that's just fancy talk for 1/2-inch rebar. They're going to ask you what length sticks you want it. You can get them in either 20 or 40-foot sticks. And also they're going to ask you what grade. So there'll be a 40 or a 60 grade. So the 60 grade, having a higher carbon content, will be harder to cut and it'll be harder to bend. I decided to go with the 40 grade so I can cut and bend it a little easier anyways. I bought 2 tons and that is 150 sticks per ton. Now there's no wrong way to cut your rebar. You can do an angle grinder, sawzall, torch, whatever, but there is easier and harder methods. You know, manual method like the old crank and chop deal is pretty tough, so you want to be prepared for that. Now what I did is I used the plasma cutter to whip all these things up, because you're gonna have to make a lot of cuts. So I did all the cuts that I can do at the shop, and then I'll have to go to less desirable methods when I'm actually at the site. But a plasma cutter has definitely been the easiest of the ways I've tried. Now you want to be prepared to bend this rebar. Now I just built a homemade tool. I'll link a video to the build and the use of it. But you can buy a tool. The cheapest one's roughly $100 and they go up pretty steeply from there. Now you're going to need some rebar chairs. Now my footer is going to be 1 foot thick and 2 foot wide. So common sense would tell you that if you have a foot thick footer that you would want the rebar right in the center, so you'd want a 6-inch chair. But that's actually incorrect. So concrete has really high compressive strength, but actually pretty low tensile strength. So the rebar is there to provide tensile strength, and since all the pressure will be coming in from the top on the concrete, the compressed side, most of the tensile force will be exerted on the bottom of the slab. To prevent the bottom of the footer from breaking out like this, our rebar needs to be in the lower half, or roughly lower third, of the concrete slab. Now for rebar to work effectively, it needs to be encased in a pretty decent amount of concrete though, so we're not just going to put it 1 inch above the bottom of the footer. We're going to bump it up 3 to 4 inches. And really, the rule of thumb is you want a minimum of 2 inches encasing the rebar. That way the concrete just don't bust out around it. Now, all rebar will rust inside of the concrete, but if there is any rebar extending through the concrete touching the soil, it will rust quicker than just being encased in the concrete. We want to do our very best to not have any kind of metal touching dirt that is then connected to our rebar. So part of the purpose that I bring that up is you can buy steel rebar chairs. For the most part you would think, well, steel is better than plastic, so that's the route I would want to go. But for the reason I was just talking about, we kind of want to avoid steel rebar chairs. So that's the purpose of me buying these plastic footer rebar chairs. And you can actually pick up the steel ones for about 20 to 30% cheaper than these guys here. There's the brand there, not sponsored or anything. Purchased these with my own dollars. But something nice about these is that they can just have the rebar snap right in them. These are a little less than 4 inches tall, so that gets me to the proper level that I want the rebar to sit. I also compacted about 1 inch of gravel all the way around, just to kind of even up the dips, make it a little easier to figure concrete. Now I'm having to do steps in my footer to keep the proper depth and also not to waste too much concrete. And the other one over here. Now if you're working with a nice level area, you're not going to have to mess with that. And that'll be nice because this does add some complexity. Now, something you need to think a little bit about is where your plumbing is going to exit. So mine's going to exit over here, but since there's going to be so much backfill that I put back in here, I'm going to set my plumbing up to go through my form boards after I pour the footer. So if you don't have that much depth, you might want to go ahead and set up your 12-inch pipe to run your plumbing and stuff through in the footer before you actually pour it, because you don't want your water too close to the topsoil, it'll freeze. Now, I bought 60 rebar chairs for the footer, so that works out to where I can space them out about 4 to 5 feet. Really, once the concrete's poured, that money's kind of wasted, because all the chairs have to do is hold the rebar in place until the concrete's poured. So if you want, you can try and space them out a little farther to save some money. Just make sure that rebar doesn't push down to the ground real easy. All right, I'm gonna start laying out the rebar. Now, if you're only doing 2 channels in your footer, you might want to go ahead and skip ahead in the video and do the grade pins first. So the grade pins is what actually tells you how high you need to be pouring as you're going. We'll be nailing rebar into the ground and setting it with the laser just to keep our grade correct. Now, that would be easiest right now to do it while there's no other rebar down here. But since I'm using 3-channel rebar, it's going to be really hard to gauge where to put those pins and not end up intersecting with one of my other cross tie rebars. Now we're going to be starting with the corners. So I've already bent up 12 of these. Now I'm using the most basic cornering method. So if you look, all my edges are lined up and I am alternating long end and short end just to make sure we don't have too many seams in the same area. All the corners done, so now time to do the centers. The thing to remember with number 4 rebar is we want to overlap the seams by 2 feet at each seam. And if you want to avoid some cutting or whatnot, you can overlap even more if you have a stick go long. Now I'm using these pre-formed ties. They come on a long strip, and these are worth buying. You can save a little bit of money and cut out your own, but I don't think this is the good spot to save money at. So while these rebar chairs do snap in, I'm not quite trusting of them, and I really don't want the rebar to pop out as I'm pouring, so I'm going through and tying all the chairs as well. So let me show you how this tool works. So you just flip your tie up like that, stick your tool in there, and just pull and twist. Easy as that. Well worth the money. So got all my cross ties on. Now I've spaced these cross ties about 4 to 5 feet, and I cut all mine about 20 inches long, and so in some places it was too close to the dirt, so I put them a little bit crooked like that. And so looking back, I think I would cut them at 18 inches for this 2-foot wide footer if I was to do it again, just to gain a little clearance between the dirt. So what I'm doing right now is I'm setting all the grade pins. So the grade pin in these footers is just some 1/2-inch rebar that I've cut to 2-foot lengths and then hammer into the ground. And I set all these grade pins with my laser to get my desired depth. So these grade pins will be staying in the concrete and they are in contact with the ground. So these pins will be sacrificial. They'll eventually rust out, but they're not for any kind of structural integrity. This is just so when we're pouring the footer, we have a reference of how high the concrete needs to be. So the concrete will come to the top of the grade pin as we go along. You can do this with just a string and a bubble. It might take longer, but the results will still be really good. So before you start setting your pins, you want to find your highest point in your footer and also determine your thickness of your footer. So my main goal is about 12 inches thick for the footer. Now, in a perfect world, this footer depth would be the exact same all the way around and it'd make it really easy to figure the concrete, but likely that's not the case. from my highest point in the footer hole, I'm going to set my pin at 10 inches, and at my thickest point in the footer it will be 18 inches. So splitting the difference can help you save a little bit on concrete if it's not absolutely necessary that it has to be a certain thickness, but it's always best to err on the side of thicker or stronger. Just a tip for your uprights that you're going to be wet setting in the concrete: line up all the tops and measure down from the top, and then make your mark with some paint. Make it super easy to set. And also, if you're like me and you just kind of rough cut all the lengths, they're a little bit uneven, so just measure this portion here and make sure it's not going to extend through the footer and contact the ground. Concrete truck showed up at 12:30 and it was 95 degrees. So the main issue we had is that it was just so hot and the concrete was setting up fast. So I had my two buddies help me from work, and also my dad. Now my two buddies have never done any concrete, and me and Dad just have a little bit of experience, but we were able to pour this fairly easy. So the steps turned out pretty nice. We also poured some piers. So the damage of the day, I ended up buying 38 yards of concrete for a total of $5,600. Also the $2,000 for all the rebar, which that's all the rebar to do the slab as well. And I paid each of my buddies $120 a piece for about 3 hours worth of work. So when I figured the concrete, I figured it at 32 yards to pour all the footing and the piers. So to be safe, I went ahead and ordered another 6 yards. Pouring, we actually finished everything we needed to with 30 yards. So I had 8 extra yards I had to find a place to use. So we kind of scrambled, but we ended up doing a little bit of this flat work. So this is 8 yards I had to disperse through here, but this makes a nice brooch for my road. Turned out okay, considering that we just kind of threw her down there and spread her out and did this broom finish. So something to note is when you're figuring concrete and you order high, is be prepared to have a place to put it. Don't be like me and have to scramble.
Keep thinking.